This time, for certain reason, I'm joining from mobile. So you are welcome to the 57th event out of a series of 75. 57th event of Global Communication Education Conclave, organized by Global Media Education Council. The council headed by Professor K.G. Suresh as the president, and I'm the secretary, and there are 3 vice presidents from India, 9 vice presidents from 9 different countries other than India. You have already seen their names in the short video. Maybe all could not be read in the speed, but there are more than 100 other professors, assistant professors, senior professors of all types from various parts of India and a few from Bangladesh who have joined in this council, and we are organizing 75 events focused on 75 different themes in the context of 75 years of India's independence. It's a marathon one, at least to my knowledge and to our colleagues' knowledge. There is no such long series running for more than 7 months, over 75 evenings, looking at various aspects of media and communication. And I must also tell at the very beginning, each of this session, which will roughly be around 2 hours or 1.5 to 2 hours, is being edited into 1 hour episode. And a series is going to be released in a YouTube channel. And also the links are going to be shared with 745 media schools of India and abroad of independent institutes and universities who are connected with GMAC now. That's the second one after this live program, the second usage. Third is we are coming out with 3 books. One book titled 75 Jewels in the World of Media and Communication of India, Indian Media and Communication. Today, one of them will be awarded as well. And 74 have already been, 74 others are there. Today is the 57th, so 56 people have been already awarded. And these people would be, these scholars, they are the leading scholars of the country in media and communication. I'm happy we have a lady today, and that's indeed interesting. We have these leading scholars from every part of the country, from extreme Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Nagaland to Kerala, from Kashmir to Gujarat, all parts of the country. So there is a book where each of them would write on a contemporary topic, ideally the topic on which they are speaking, their own profiles and photographs. This is a tribute to these 75 stalwarts of media and communication education in India. This is one book. The second book is titled Contemporary Reflections on Contemporary Media. And these will contain or consist of the summarized short write-ups by each of the speakers who are speaking in each of these programs, apart from the winner. Winner, there is a separate book, as I told, and others, and therefore I'll request Professor John Butcher and other speakers who are here today, who would be speaking, to support our leader of the day, Professor Momita Dedas, with your articles in times to come. And the third book is on the research papers. So on most of the days, there are research papers also being presented by scholars and professors from India and outside. So 50 of them are also coming as a book. So these 3 books, live program and 1 hour video is the outcome. 75 videos is the outcome of this particular program. I just wanted to tell it at the beginning because our efforts are sincere to reach out to as many people as possible. All the speakers will get the links of their videos, and I would request them that they should share with their peers and students so that people understand, people get to know about what is being discussed today and in these days, 75 days on media communication, education, and aspects of media. With this backdrop to this whole concept, there are other programs of GMAC which will be coming after April. We will complete the 75 by 30th of April, this month, and we started on 21st of October 2021. GMAC is purely a COVID baby. It was born in 2021 during the lockdown through brainstorming of some of the scholars from all over the country. And gradually, many young professors also joined in. And one of them is Professor Momita Dedas, assistant professor from Adams University, Kolkata. Teaching experience, and before that, several years of working in the media, notably Times of India and Hindustan Times. She has also worked with the BBC on a project, and she has been a voice in the radio as well. And her education, she has got double masters, one in international relations, one in media and communication, journalism, media and communication. Apart from that, several other diplomas and all. I'm not getting into all that. She's a very loved teacher at Adams University. She also takes sessions of international relations in the liberal arts, social sciences school of Adams. I have the pleasure of now handing over the baton to the leader of today's evening, Professor Momita Dedas, who would be taking us through the next 120 minutes of intellectual discourse on the theme of the day. I would not introduce the theme of the day, that's for her. It's her baby. Today's evening is completely her baby. I'm only happy to say that there is now gradually, slowly, but very solidly, one international organization of media educators emerging from South Asia. Most of the others media educators bodies are either from US or from Australia or from UK. Very good, nothing wrong. Also from Canada, nothing wrong. The only thing is that this perhaps is one of the very rare ones which have started from South Asia, and that too on the 75th year of India's independence, and now spreading its wings across various parts of the world. Our first global meet of GMAC will happen in January 2023 in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And our first Indian physical meet, this will be physical meet, I mean face-to-face. And the first Indian physical meet shall be in West Bengal, Darjeeling in October 2022, this year. But till then, we shall continue meeting online. And beyond them, also continue meeting online. Thank you. And over to you, Madam Momita Dedas, for carrying us through.
Thank you, sir, for your heartfelt introduction. I think I'm audible and visible to all of you.
Very much, very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for your heartfelt introduction. Good evening to all the dignitaries, my dear colleagues, friends, and students present here. I, Momita Dedas, welcome you all to this 57th day of the Global Communication Education Conclave, organized by the Global Media Education Council. I render my earnest gratitude to the Council to provide me this opportunity in this prestigious platform. The theme of this evening is transmedia storytelling. I'll start with a quote by famous American media scholar Henry Jenkins, who said, "Transmedia storytelling is the art of world making. It represents a process where integral elements of a fiction get dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. Ideally, each medium makes its own unique contribution to the unfolding of the story." Jenkins described how the story told in the transmedia storytelling is, for the example, Matrix movie, which was a trilogy, was expanded in the comic books, video games, and animated short films. His main point was not simply that the creators used multiple mediums, but rather that parts of the story completely absent from the films were told in the other media products. Most of the scholarship around transmedia storytelling so far has concerned entertainment and fictional story worlds, including Harry Potter, Star Wars, and complex television series such as Lost. We should remember that a transmedia storytelling is not just justification. Advertising has been a transmedia experience since the explosion of mass media in the first half of the 20th century. And the same can be said about the journalism as well. Non-fiction transmedia storytelling is still an unexplored territory waiting for its explorers. The question arises, how can we inspire and teach future journalists to be effectively experiment with telling various parts of a story across multiple mediums and different platforms. There are three main factors involved in transmedia journalism, for example, multiple media platforms, content expansion, and audience engagement. Transmedia storytelling may include live performances and geolocated games such as scavenger hunts, as well as printed books or pamphlets, online databases, and on-site audio tours. Today, we have illustrious panelists who would discuss on this theme. Without further ado, I call upon our chair session of the day, Professor Shubir Ghosh, sir, and I'll just give you the brief introduction of sir. He has been a very illustrious professor and has started his career with Hindustan Standard ABP Group in the 60s and 70s. Then he went on to become the lecturer in the Bhairav Ganguly College, then staff reporter with the Statesman, public relations, chief public relations officer in Fertilizer Corporation, India, and also the deputy general manager with Hindustan Paper Corporation. Currently part-time faculty with the St. Xavier's University, Newtown, St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, and also the former principal of Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, Ashutosh College of Communication and Management, Kolkata. He has a few of the very popular books, which even I recommend to my students and I refer to while teach mass communication. One is Mass Communication Indian Perspective, then Public Relations Today, Brahmo Bandhe Upadhyay, monographs, media relations, and etc. I welcome sir to start the session and say a few words. Over to you, sir. Sir, are you there? Shubir sir, can you just, yeah. Shubir sir, can you just come on line?
There are two Shubirs today. There are two Shubirs today. Can you tell the full name?
Yeah, Professor Shubir Ghosh.
He's there.
Huh. So can you just switch on your video and please start the session?
I request everyone to check their video and audio. That's the normal basic practice these days on webinars.
Sir, are you there? I can see you.
Yes, I am.
Yes, sir, please come on video and start the session. Yeah.
Well,
thank you, sir.
Let me congratulate at the outset the Global Media Education Council and their associates for the opportunity they have created for all of us at this webinar to deliberate on transmedia storytelling, an emerging journalistic technique that appeals to the readers all over the world, especially in the West. Well, Global Leaders in Media Development, Thomson Foundation, it describes successful news writing in our time as the art of storytelling. It describes journalism as storytelling with a purpose. Many journalists believe that the approach makes news meaningful to the consumers, and some again consider storytelling as the most fundamental skill of all that journalism involves, its roots going back to the antiquity, to ancient India, Europe, and Arabia. In fact, in the Orient, the goals of the Buddhist tales of Jataka, the popular Katha Shri Sagar, or Dondin's Dashakumar Charit, or the Arabian tales, and even our folk media have identical goals. How to communicate, how to persuade, how to motivate, and how to grab people's attention. The distinguished scholar, William James Potter, he once told us that news is not something that happens. Instead, news is what gets presented. We almost never see news events as they happen. Instead, we are shown the media's manufactured construction of the events. And people, we all know, love to read about people. And from this point of view, journalism can be defined more simply as storytelling or news information of any form. And how a story is told is more important today to the audience than what it is about. The best story is a well-told tale about something the reader feels is relevant or significant. A good story is built not just on facts. Good stories reflect good choices, selection rather than compression. Now, I would plead, before I conclude, I would plead fervently for the Indianization of the content and carry out more authentic field-based research to give an Indian voice to the art of storytelling instead of blindly imitating the West. And still better, if our distinguished panelists, they refer to the actual examples of storytelling as it is being practiced by Indian newspapers or the Indian media, say in English, and our mother tongues like Odia, Tamil, Gujarati, Hindi, Malayalam, Bangla, and other languages. That be doing an human service to the teachers and students of the subject alike, and would be a means for a new kind of enlightenment. Well, I would not like to stand any further between the knowledgeable audience and our distinguished speakers. And with these words, I think the seminar proper can begin with our speaker leading the charge.
Thank you, sir.
You.
Thank you, sir.
My parents, and thank you.
Thank you. Now we welcome our first guest of the evening, our keynote speaker, Dr. John Butcher. To give you his illustrious background, John Butcher is a mythologist and storyteller based out of Hollywood, California. He serves as creative director for the Joseph Campbell Foundation and is also an author, podcaster, and speaker. He has worked with companies including HBO, DC Comics, the History Channel, A24 Films, the John Maxwell Leadership Foundation, and served as a consultant and writer for numerous film, television, and virtual reality projects. He's the author of 6 books, including the best-selling storytelling for virtual reality, named by Book Authority as one of the best storytelling books of all time. Disruptor named him one of the top 25 influencers in virtual reality. John teaches writing and story courses in the Los Angeles area and around the world. He holds a PhD in mythology and depth psychology and has spoken on 5 continents about using the power of story and myth to reframe how individuals, organizations, cultures, and nations are viewed. You can learn more about him at his website, tellingabetterstory.com. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. It is just a pleasure to be with all of you. And I want to extend my greetings and deep thanks to each one of the professors who's begun our session today, and to the leadership of GMEC for having me, and especially to Madam Momita Dedas, who has graciously invited me to be a part of this. And I'm just so thankful for this opportunity. I work out of Hollywood, California, but tonight I am actually in Australia, where I am working at the University of Melbourne with a group here. And it's actually quite late. It's about 12:30 in the morning, but I said, I do not care. I want to be a part of this very important event. And the topic of transmedia storytelling is very near and dear to my heart. And the work that GMEC is doing is very significant to me. So I just can't thank you enough for this opportunity to come and share with you a bit about this idea and concept of transmedia storytelling. with all the talk about storytelling that we've already begun to initiate tonight, I thought it might be an appropriate beginning for my address to you to begin by telling you a story. Because we cannot talk about storytelling without bringing in the power of story in and of itself. And because I'm in Australia tonight, I'd like to share with you the story of a group of Australian archaeologists who traveled across the sea in the last century. In the early part of the last century, they boarded the boats and they took off across the sea to the coast of China. They went on this long trip because they had heard stories about a group of monks practicing up in the hills in northern China. And these monks were supposedly practicing the art of Zen archery. Now, the story goes that these monks had the capability to shoot arrows from a great long distance and hit targets dead in the center that they couldn't even see. Well, these archaeologists had heard this story many, many times, and they decided they must go and see this for themselves. So they made the great journey across the sea. They finally arrived on the coast of China, and after many weeks, they ventured deep into the mountains to go and see these monks. So the first day, they sat and they watched as the monks spent hours and hours chanting and praying and singing. And at the end of the first day, the monks went over to the side of the mountain. They fired the arrows from their bows down into the forest below the mountains. Everyone went to sleep. And everyone woke up early the next morning and they traveled down the mountain into the forest. And on the trees in the forest were targets with arrows right in the dead center of each target. The anthropologists could not believe their eyes. They could not believe what they were seeing. So the second day, they watched very closely again as the monks chanted and they prayed and they sang. And again, at the end of the day, they walked to the edge of the mountain and they fired their arrows down into the forest below. Everyone went to sleep. And again, the next morning, they all ventured down into the forest. And this time on the trees, different targets with new arrows right in the center. This went on for weeks and weeks. The anthropologists watching very closely, trying to see what the secret was that these monks had, this Zen archery that was happening. And after weeks, they could not figure it out. So they decided to go back home, realizing that some things are just not meant to be understood. Well, on the morning that it was time for them to go home, they packed up all their belongings. They traveled down the hill. And as they were going through the forest out of the mountains, there they saw the monks. And they saw in the trees arrows sticking to the trees, and the monks with buckets of paint painting targets around wherever the arrows had hit in the trees. I would suggest to you that many of us approach transmedia storytelling in much the same way. We fire our arrows out into the media landscape, and wherever those arrows hit, we paint a target around it and say, that's exactly what I meant to do. I would suggest to you, however, tonight, that I believe there's a better way. And I'd like to share with you some of my ideas around transmedia storytelling of what that better way could look like. I believe that transmedia storytelling is a path to the future. Transmedia storytelling has become an essential practice in how we communicate narratives in every media field, and we must understand how it works and how it can be implemented. Transmedia storytelling has become an essential practice in so many ways. And while stories themselves can be universal, the mediums and applications by which they are delivered are constantly changing. We're finding new ways to tell stories all the time. And those that work at the intersection of these changes will have the greatest advantages in the global marketplace. There are many among us who really understand the technology behind transmedia storytelling. But I would suggest to you tonight, as important as it is to understand the technology, it is equally important, if not more important, to understand story and to understand storytelling. There was a famous American writer once that said that everyone knows what story is until they sit down to tell one or to write one. And then it becomes a bit fuzzy. Every one of us have that member of our family who loves to tell stories that seemingly go on and never seem to get to a point. We can recognize that storytelling is important, but not only is storytelling important, there are such things as good stories and bad stories. Stories well told and stories poorly told. I would also suggest to you tonight that there's a difference between story creation and storytelling. Story creation is taking from our imagination ideas and putting those ideas out into a packaged medium. Storytelling very well may be taking the ideas of others, the things that others say. This is especially true in journalism, where it's the practice of storytelling rather than story creation. In other disciplines, such as film, television, script writing, theater, these disciplines, we see story creation as well as storytelling. We have to be able to get into the details of these disciplines to understand what it is that we're trying to do. I believe it's important that we keep the main thing the main thing. And it can be easy to focus on the various mediums available within transmedia storytelling. However, having a compelling story is perhaps the most essential component, regardless of the medium. Some of the examples that Madame Momita Dedas gave with The Matrix and Star Wars and these larger stories that have been able to transcend space and time and the various mediums of which they could appear. These stories, the world building that has occurred in these stories, it only works. It's only able to move from comic books to film to television to graphic novels to virtual reality. It's only able to transcend all of these different mediums because the story was first initially well told. I would suggest to you tonight, as you begin to think about transmedia storytelling, it becomes very tempting to try and master a large number of mediums with your story right from the beginning. However, I've seen most effectively those that have mastered transmedia storytelling recognize, let me tell the story effectively first in a single medium. And then perhaps a couple of hours, days, months, years later, I can expand the mediums of which I tell that story. But we often can become tempted with all the possibilities of all the many different medias, and we can fail before we ever get the story launched successfully in a singular medium. New mediums arise all the time. It can be quite overwhelming. As long as we've got a story that is large enough to work in a single medium well, we can then begin to expand our thinking into these larger, more significant mediums that are being developed. I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years working in virtual reality and augmented reality. And even though my background is very much in traditional film and television in these media that we have had developed for decades, I'm finding those that knew how to master the visual mediums of film and television had such an advantage over those who had never worked in those traditional media as they came in to begin working in progressive media like virtual reality and augmented reality, because it was taking so many of the same ideas and concepts. Now, we recognize in these new media that we had gotten locked in, for lack of a better term, and that was because for over 100 years, everything that we wanted the audience to see in our story fit inside a frame. Just as you're watching me tonight, inside this frame, anything that's outside of this frame, by very nature of the visual component, it's insignificant. Only what is inside the frame, what is directed inside the frame, becomes significant to the audience. And this is all of the story that is being told, is what is inside this frame you're watching me right now. However, with these new progressive media, with virtual reality, with augmented reality, we've removed the edges of the frame. And now we've allowed the audience to look in any direction that they want. And the audience has become such a more significant participant in the storytelling. We're hearing this term in transmedia storytelling a lot these days around agency and what it is to have agency within a story. And of course, what agency is for the audience is the ability to make decisions. Now, some of the research that my colleagues and I have participated in would suggest to us that the amount of agency an audience desires can be tied to the audience's age. Let me explain this for a moment. My dear friend Ted Schilowitz, who is the futurist for Paramount Pictures in Hollywood, has suggested to me that younger audiences who are still in school, they are told what to do every minute of the day. Go to this class, eat lunch, then go to this class and this class. All the decisions in life are made for them because they're children. At the end of the day, when they get out of school, many of those same children are anxious to make their own decisions. This is why we see video games often be very, very popular among younger demographics, because these younger audiences, they've not gotten to make any decisions all day. And so they crave that agency. Now, as you can see by the color of my beard, I'm not a child anymore. I've lived a few years on this planet, and I make decisions all day long. And at the end of the day, I don't want to make any more decisions. I don't want to play video games. I don't want agency. I want Netflix or Disney to make all the decisions for me. Just tell me what to watch and just give it to me. I don't want to be making all those decisions, but I'm old. So we have to recognize that not every story is for every audience. And not every audience is for every story. See, this is a significant idea in transmedia storytelling, because every audience is not going to want the story that they connect with brought over into multiple mediums. It, in many ways, is the rare story that can transcend across all these mediums. So we have to be aware that not every story is going to be a good fit for transmedia storytelling. We have to find the right medium for the story, and we don't necessarily need to use multiple mediums just because we can. Finding the right medium for the story you're trying to tell is so important. See, some of the stories that we try to tell are inherently served by specific mediums. Many of the stories that are told in the world of video games, for example, are stories that are well served by video games because they're stories that require a lot of decision-making, a lot of agency. On the other hand, certain films, certain television programs, these are stories told from a specific point of view, and to try and give the audience agency within those films, those television shows, would rob them of their power. It would also isolate a certain audience. While my nieces and nephews enjoy playing games where they can make all these decisions, that story may no longer appeal to me if I have to make decisions. However, if that story is broad enough, if that story is grand enough, perhaps that story can fit into a medium that I am happy to participate in. So, for example, I may be too tired at the end of the day to play a video game based on Star Wars, but I may not be too tired to watch one of the Star Wars movies. I may not be too tired to read one of the Star Wars books. This is the power of transmedia storytelling. This is the unique power of finding mediums to express a story in, but that story has to have a big enough world and big enough ideas in order to support that. Sometimes there may only be two media that we can tell a specific story in. I'm seeing this often be the case with journalism. There's a great revival of storytelling through podcasts in journalism. And sometimes what has once been a short video story becomes a very long podcast series, and that story is able to be told effectively in short video form as well as in longer podcast form. Now, this is all new for all of us. No one has completely mastered the art of transmedia storytelling yet. As transmedia storytellers, we have to be open to giving ourselves a little bit of grace. We have to be open to giving ourselves the permission to sometimes make mistakes, and we may find the story that we're trying to tell, it just doesn't translate well into this medium or that medium. With storytelling, as much as we would like for there to be a formula that helps us to engage, storytelling is not a formula. Storytelling is not formulaic. Story is a form. It's an art form. It's a craft. Much like painting or dancing or carving wood. It is a craft that doesn't require formulas, but a deep understanding of the form. And sometimes the painter must throw the canvas away and start over. Sometimes they have to paint over something that has been painted previously. The discipline to recognize when something is not working within our transmedia storytelling efforts is just as essential as recognizing what is effective. What we cannot do is what I talked about at the very beginning of my talk tonight, where we fire whatever we do into the forest, and whatever it hits, we just say, yeah, that's what I meant to do. It's great. No, we have to be, in many ways, very honest about what's working and what's not. And we live in a time that honesty is much easier to come by because we have the power of analytics and we have the ability to collect data and understand what is resonating with people and what's not. And while we can often understand what stories resonate and what mediums with people and what does not, we often don't understand why. And it's that why that we study as storytellers, and especially as transmedia storytellers. But this is a young art form, transmedia storytelling, and we don't have answers yet for all of the whys. I'd like to offer you an idea that might be a different framework for looking at transmedia storytelling, because many of us who come to transmedia storytelling through a previous discipline often want to use the same structures as we used in that discipline. So if we come, say, from video production, and we are moving into, say, augmented reality, we may want to use the same frameworks and structures for video production that we used previously as we begin to work in augmented reality. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. I've been working on a media theory that I'd like to share with you tonight that I believe serves transmedia quite well. I refer to this media theory as shards theory. Shards, S-H-A-R-D-S. And shards are what we have when glass breaks. Those pieces of glass when glass breaks are shards. I want you to imagine with me for just a moment that we have a beautiful glass vase in front of us. And inside of this glass vase, we're going to put in every element of story. We're going to put in every character, every world. We're going to put in all the ideas about story structure. We're going to put in everything we ever have learned or know about storytelling inside this glass vase. Now I want you to imagine I take that glass vase and I drop it on the ground, and the glass breaks into 10,000 pieces. And we have all these pieces of story. Transmedia storytelling requires us to pick up the shards of glass and to create a beautiful mosaic. A mosaic work of art of the shards of glass from storytelling. So this may mean in the story we're trying to tell, we're not going to have the traditional story elements of a beginning, a middle, and an end. It may not be that type of story, but what we may be taking are the shards of glass that have to deal with character and what we understand about character. And we may put those shards into the mosaic we're creating. We may take different shards of glass that help us understand about world building and how certain elements of world building are significant. And we may take those shards of glass and add it to the mosaic that we're trying to create. While entire stories may not always be transferable to other mediums, often the characters within the world itself will be. Finding ways to parse what can be moved across mediums and what cannot is an essential skill for transmedia storytellers. I've only got a few minutes left, but I want to share with you one or two more ideas before I close my time with you today. I think it's so significant before we can tell a story across mediums that we must first make sure that we understand that we're actually telling a story. We often make assumptions that any collection of ideas or any sequence of facts is a story, and I would suggest to you that it's not. There are certain elements to what a story is, especially when we think about what an effective story is. I had a media mentor who used to explain it to me like this. There's a very significant difference between a story and a scenario. We might look at it like this. A scenario is a cat lying on a blanket. There's really no story there. We have a character, but they're just a cat lying on a blanket. This is a scenario. A story is a cat lying on a dog's blanket. Now, suddenly, we have characters and we have conflict. Suddenly, there's motivations. There's things that the characters want. It is my belief that when we talk about what a story is, especially as it applies in media, we could define it a great number of ways. But here is how I think of story, especially when it applies in a transmedia storytelling environment. I believe that a story really boils down to someone trying to solve a problem or achieve a goal. I'm going to say that again because I feel like that's really good. It took me a long time to come to that understanding. So I'm going to say that one more time. A story, I believe, it boils down to someone trying to solve a problem or someone trying to achieve a goal. Now, many of us in media are visual storytellers. We're taking pictures, we're taking images, and we're juxtaposing those things. If you'll afford me here just the opportunity to do this, I'm going to share my screen for just a moment, and I'm going to ask you a question. Can everyone see this this image that is on your screen?
Yes,
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Okay. So I want you to think about for a moment, is this a story? I would suggest to you it's really not. We could create a story about this rabbit. We could tell a story about this rabbit, but just this image alone, I would suggest to you is a scenario. It's not a story. I'd like to show you another image. Now, I saw some of the looks on your faces for just a moment. Your smile formed. I saw one or two of you that your head kind of went back. And if I could read into your brain, I bet some of you inside your mind went, oh, oh. I'm guessing many of you had this image and this story formed in your mind that the rabbit got hit by the truck. Now, I want to say to you that I'm not in any way suggesting that the rabbit got hit by the truck. I might be telling a story that the rabbit was driving the truck. But it's not how our brains work. See, visual storytelling relies on the juxtaposition of one image next to another. And when we place one image next to another image, it forms a story in our heads. It forms a story in our minds. And the art of storytelling relies on us knowing what image to place what next to another image and what story is formed in someone's head. If I placed, instead of a truck next to the rabbit, and if I placed the image of a tennis shoe, a sneaker, it would be a completely different story in your mind. But knowing how we juxtapose images next to each other, how we create imagery and stories to tell stories across mediums is so significant and important. I'd like to close with this idea. I recently read by an author named Brandon Sanderson in a book called The Way of Kings, that the purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon.
John, a great talk indeed, a very good talk. Thank you very much for that. I know we have other speakers also, but still I'm so much tempted to ask you one question. Um,
Yes.
Avatar, the movie Avatar, had
Yes.
possibly earned the highest revenue of any feature film in the world, and it has been dubbed into 26 languages, if I'm not wrong, all across the world. It had perhaps crossed $7 or $8 billion. Now, why do you think a story? We all know the story of Avatar. So
Yeah.
why did it go so gung ho across the world and could make such money? Was it
Yeah.
that the producers could afford that, or there was something inherent in the story that it could be taken by different cultures across all these 6, 7 continents, and various peoples? That's one question. And the second, because we are running short of time, I'll ask both the questions together. You answer in brief together. The second question is, you have spoken a lot about transmedia storytelling and how and why good stories go transmedia. But often we find that it's imagination, science fiction, or things like that, fantasy, which actually go multimedia, go transmedia. Why is it not that real life stories of pain and suffering, joy and happiness of real life people actually are transmedia stories? It's more of imagination and science fiction. These two questions to you, John, but it has been a fabulous talk indeed.
Thank you so much. And what wonderful questions for me to end on. Let me briefly address your question about Avatar. And my belief is this film did tap into an ancient universal pattern of archetypal storytelling. And it's been described in a number of ways. We've heard it described as the monomyth. Joseph Campbell described it as the hero's journey. But we see this story across cultures and across time and space. And if we had more time, I would get into what the specific elements of that story are, but they're the same elements that we find in stories from the Bhagavad Gita to Star Wars, all the way through history. In every major culture, we see similar stories being told. The last thing I'll say about that is I've had the privilege to be in 43 countries in the last 15 years. And every country I go to, I always ask, what are the stories you tell your children when they're small? And I notice certain stories resonate again and again. For example, almost every culture I've ever been a part of is familiar with some version of the story of Cinderella. And the story of Cinderella seems to find its way and be morphed into every culture I've ever been in. Her name changes, the situation changes, but there's something about that story that draws us as humans. To answer your second question, and I'm so glad you asked this question, because the answer in many ways is one of my favorite things to address, and it really is, in my opinion. Let me have you, just because I fear others may have already forgotten what the second question was. So could you re-ask the second question?
The second question was, why is it that most of the transmedia storytelling deal with science fiction or fantasy and less with actual real life human beings, their joys or their sufferings,
Yes.
usually, if not always?
And you're right. It is almost always that this is the case, that these stories become transmedia. I think there's two answers to this question. And the first answer is, I believe it is much easier to draw an audience into a transmedia story across mediums when the world is expansive. Psychologically, most human beings feel like they have a pretty good understanding of our world. Whether they do or not, we could debate. But most human beings feel like they understand our world and the limitations of our world. When we set a story in a fantasy land, in a fantasy world, in space, we know we don't begin to understand the expanses of that. So it lends itself to transmedia storytelling. The last thing I'll say on that is I prepare to go to sleep tonight and bid you all farewell. As
Thank you.
yeah, I really believe storytelling is universal. And while my experience of pain and suffering in the United States may be very different than yours in India, storytelling itself is universal. And we could both tell stories about space. And we may see it differently, but it's common to us. It's universal
Good.
to us.
Yes.
And I believe
Well
that
spoken.
is what unites us. Yeah. Thank
Well
you so much
spoken.
for the
Thank you.
opportunity to be with you tonight.
Thank
It's
you
such a
for
pleasure.
thank you for waking up till or beyond 1 o'clock in the night for us. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so
Back to
much,
Momita.
everyone.
Thank you,
Good
sir.
night.
Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
excellent deliberation. We have some takeaways from your session. That is, transmedia storytelling is a craft. Every story is unique according to audience's profile. And you've also referred to Shah's theory by you, specifically you. And at the end, you said that storytelling is universal. Thank you so much for this session. And good night. And
Thank
hope to
you.
reconnect again.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Our second guest of the evening is eminent corporate speaker, Mr. Shubir Bhomik. Shubir Bhomik is a veteran BBC and Reuters journalist in South Asia. He started with PTI and then worked in Anandabajar Group before moving to Reuters and then BBC, where he worked for 17 years. After retirement from BBC, he worked as senior editor in bdnews24.com of Bangladesh and Mizima Media of Myanmar. Bhomik has been a Queen Elizabeth Fellow at Oxford, a Senior Fellow at East West Center, Washington, and Eurasian Fellow at Frankfurt University. He is author of 5 books on conflict and media. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, at the very outset, thanks for inviting me to speak on transmedia storytelling. There are stories which are told in forms of journalistic output, and there are stories which are told in terms of fiction, and those formats are essentially different. It was wonderful listening to Professor John Butcher, very thought-provoking. I, of course, listened to the last bit of his presentation. But I will, as a professional journalist, I will try to insist that I stick to the mass media journalistic realm of storytelling and talk about transmedia storytelling within this ambit. I will keep out things like films and, science fiction and stuff like that, because that's not my forte. I have not done any fiction. I started writing some spy stories recently in my mother tongue, Bangla, based on actual experiences, but I've not gone very far on that. So I'll basically stick to the mass media journalism ambit. But there is a huge world as far as transmedia storytelling is concerned within the ambit of journalism and mass media. I will also bring to bear here the aspect of language, because I have myself been a multimedial journalist and a multilingual journalist. And I've seen how, like the shard theory, it makes a lot of sense here. There may be some essential reality. When the glass jar exists, it's perhaps the essential reality. When it falls and breaks into 1,000 pieces, then the question of mosaic that John was talking about and how you weave that mosaic, that's actually the storytelling bit of it. And that varies depending on where you are and what your canvas is. Yeah. So that depends on your target audience, the audience that you are trying to aim your story at, because you don't try to tell the story in the same way if your audience is a world audience. So when I'm broadcasting for BBC World, the very same story will be put out in a different way, which seeks to make sense to a listener in US, UK, Russia, India, wherever, so long as they understand the language that I'm broadcasting in. But when I'm trying to broadcast the same story in a particular language, and I did that in BBC for years, 17 years, the same story which I broadcast in English for a world audience, BBC World Service, immediately when the request comes, that we have heard your story, ABC, whatever it is, we need this for the BBC Bengali service. Immediately the angles change. Immediately my priorities change. What I go on top may differ from what was the case in the BBC World Service story put out in English. So in this BBC Hindi service, again, the angle changes, and Urdu service, and Nepali, and Burmese. Every service that I would broadcast, there would be a certain amount of tweak to suit the taste and the demand of the audience. Because over a period of time, and this is where, lies the difference between success and failure as a multimedia, multilingual broadcaster. When you do transmedia storytelling to different audiences, you aim your stories, is that you must have a pretty good understanding about your audience. The audience, the area that they live in, the language that they essentially speak in, the culture that they essentially come from, and what they expect out of a certain story which may have global resonance. Unless this subtle understanding, and this is something that can't be taught. Yeah, this is not something that BBC World Service newsroom will teach me, because they taught me the basics of journalism, broadcast journalism to be precise, and I would broadcast in radio, television, and finally online as well. This is something you pick up as you go ahead. I agree with John that when you do transmedia storytelling, you should be in command of the media that you initially hail from. But what happens to someone like me who started his career in news agency journalism with PTI and then went over to newspaper, the print media, then again news media, news agency like Reuters, and then in BBC radio to begin with, and then television, and finally online. Long journey. Every single medium, there is an essential story, of course, but the way of telling it in different media sharply varies. And what you look for, the elements that you look for to tell the same story in different media varies hugely. Varies hugely. So when you do that story for news agency or print, say for instance a story on arsenic poisoning in Bengal, the first thing you're looking for is to speak to a lot of people and gather, how this whole sort of problem has played out. In radio, the first thing, because you tell a story through sounds, is to perhaps get the sound bite of the pumping of a tubewell so that you play that sound and you say, well, these tubewells in Bengal spews not water but poison, because what comes out in the shape of water contains an unacceptable level of arsenic, which leads to huge amount of health problems. But you need that sound bite of the, so that you bring the audience and transport the audience to the village of Bengal, where this water comes through a tube well which you pump in. The tube well is something that may be typical of this place, not quite always, because I when I was a fellow in Germany and I went to a village called Spock on the German-Austrian border, I found tube wells there as well. But maybe people will understand that, the main source of water in these villages are the tube well which you pump in, and this makes a certain kind of noise. And that's how you tell the story. Of course, in television, you would get your camera has to do the trick, because if you don't have visuals, you don't have a story in television. And therefore, you got to get visuals of a similar kind. The villagers pumping the tube well, water coming out, and then of course you go to the arsenic patients, who some of whom have skin discoloration, disfiguring of skin, and stuff like that. And then you get bites, and you develop your story. You build up the whole story. The point I'm trying to make here is there is an essential story. Here is a medical problem, and the problem originates from the kind of water that you are drinking. That's the essential story. That's the glass jar. But then you drop the jar and the pieces you pick up and you paint the mosaic, the structuring of that mosaic, the structuring, I insist on the word structuring of that mosaic, which a smart craftsman, the storyteller, does, very much depends on the elements that goes on to make a particular kind of media. And your effectiveness as a transmedia storytelling has to do a lot, as John was right, with the understanding of the story. In the BBC, they said, unless you can write a clean top line, you don't know what the story is. You're going to be mixed up. You're going to be beating about the bush without actually getting on the story. So the trick of the trade and the litmus test of whether you have understood the story is to have the right kind of top line. What is the essential story? So the top line and then the first sort of lead paragraphs basically deals with what the story is, and that's something. But then that is the essence of the story. That's the glass jar before it falls and breaks. But then this reality, I'm quite impressed by that shard theory of John, is that then you work it round and play it round depending on what media you are reporting in, you are playing that story in, and that varies. The elements varies, the way you spin it up, it all varies. So the structuring of the mosaic, as I might say, depends on your understanding of the story, because that's the main thing. And then, of course, the requirements of the media, the elements that make particular media typically different from another media. So, and this also varies with the language that you are broadcasting in. The same Russia-Ukraine story, when broadcast in a certain language, the priorities of the audience are essentially different. So if you are broadcasting a Russia-Ukraine story to an Indian or a South Asian audience, you're basically thinking at the very beginning that your audience is more interested in the fallout of the crisis rather than the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day war that's taking place there. And they would be interested in stories like, who in Europe is so much interested in Indian medical students in Ukraine? But that's the top line story for us. So every newspaper, every television channel would run a main story maybe, which deals with the war that's taking place there. But essentially the big story is my boy stuck there. Yeah. So the priorities vary. One of the most important things, therefore, in this whole business of transmedia storytelling is the understanding of the media that you're broadcasting in. And here I will actually try to emphasize that all of us actually originate or come from a particular media. It's not that at the very beginning of your career, you were broadcasting for radio, television, online. No, that was not the case. You started off somewhere. I started off in a very small newspaper, actually, from the Northeast, which has gone out of circulation now. It was an English newspaper in Assam at the peak of the Assam agitation, the anti-foreigner agitation. The point I'm trying to make here is I learned this early on because then I moved on to PTI. I immediately realized that the focus of the story about this anti-foreigner agitation that one needed to have to report to an Assamese audience back home and the requirement of a transnational or trans-India agency like PTI were entirely different. The focus was entirely different. And on that depended on what kind of quotes you got. So maybe the first quote you'd look for when you are reporting this story, uh, for an Assamese newspaper would be to go to Prafulla Kumar Mohanta, who was heading the ASU at that point of time and leading the agitation. But for the same story when you did, for PTI, the first man you tried to go to was Home Minister at that point of time, Zail Singh, later president, who was actually trying to mediate and negotiate a solution to the whole crisis from the Government of India point of view. So that's how the focus changes. That's how the focus changes, and who gets how much space, how much importance, who goes on tops, who goes at the middle, and what goes at the end. It all depends on your audience that you're trying to address, the expanse of you know coverage that's expected of you in a particular media. In a regional media, it has to be tight and focused. But when it becomes national, it spreads. And if it's a global media, of course, the span is much more wider because you then need, as is the case in arithmetic, the highest common factor. So you need to look for, you know, uh, elements that will make sense and resonate with the audience over a wide geographical expanse. Now, having focused on the transmedia, the sort of transmedia storytelling as it differs from media to media, and also language to language, the focus is very, very different. And I realize this even in the fiction world. When you watch Netflix, the same Turkish filmmaker, when he makes a film with the world audience in mind, and he's looking for, his film going to Cannes or Karlovy Vary, the focus is different. Even in the fiction, the ambit of fiction, feature film, when something is made purely for a Turkish audience, well, the focus, I'm afraid, is different. When you are focusing on, and one of the major difference here is that the bigger your audience get, you need to do a lot more backgrounding. You know why? Because you can't take certain things for granted. When you're broadcasting to a tight audience, I mean a focused regional audience, you take many things for granted. You expect your regional audience to know, an Assamese newspaper audience to know who is ASU and what it stands for. But when you are broadcasting to a national audience or an international audience, you have to say all Assam Students Union is not just a students' union, it's not just a student body. It has led from time to time the most powerful agitations, political agitations in the state of Assam, and rendered existing political parties irrelevant. It has taken center stage because this is not something that usually happens across the world. So if you say all Assam Students Union, and somebody in Britain will say, students, what the hell are they doing with this kind of an agitation? Because back in England, well, the students don't do that. Perhaps in France, sometimes we've seen in 1968 during the campus revolution, students taking a lead role in certain agitations for social change, but not so much in England. So if you have to tell a British audience, ASU, Assam, they're taking the lead in agitation, trying to throw out migrants, you got to do a lot of backgrounding, in the sense you got to bring in the context and explain certain things about this organization and other things. So that's one of the major requirements, that as your focus, your camera focus expands, the focus of your storytelling expands, and it goes from regional to national to global, you need to do, as you expand, you need to do a lot of backgrounding. You need to actually, which may seem redundant to a local audience. Assamese audience, they say, এই ইমান কিয় কৈ আছে আসু টাসু লৈ আমি নাজানো নহয় আমি জানো আসু বস্তুটো কি we know what asu stands for. But then when you are doing that for a global audience or even a national audience, you need to explain. So that's one of the important features of transmedia storytelling, is that when it becomes more expansive, it calls for more backgrounding, more contextualization, and putting the whole thing in the perspective. Because it's too much to expect that a listener in France or in Britain will understand the context of the importance of student unions in the politics of Northeast India. So you got to actually say things loud. That takes more time, that takes more space. And that's where the challenge comes in, because you are having to, focus. For a global audience, they will always tell you, as my studio managers in the BBC World Service would say, oh, you need to keep your dispatch to no more than a minute, max minute and quarter. So a minute, 15 seconds maximum. But you ought to say an awful lot in that, because you got to do a lot of backgrounding. Yeah, you can't take things for granted. In linguistic storytelling, I mean, vernacular language storytelling, I found you get somewhat more space. Maybe the reason is that certain languages are very specific and less verbose. I would say that my own mother tongue is much more verbose than the language I usually used in my journalistic career, English. English is a language of understatement, but Indian languages, you need to be very much more explicit. অনেক বেশি বলতে টলতে হয় এবং সেটা লোকে প্রত্যাশাও করে. People expect you to, be more descriptive, more narrative, not in English, because English is the language of understatement. It's a cultural problem. So these are the finer points that a multilingual, multimedial storyteller, a transmedia storyteller, has to grapple with. These are very big challenges. That an understanding of the language that you are broadcasting in, because you may be broadcasting in 6 languages, as I did in the BBC. So for every single linguistic audience, you need to keep in mind who is listening to you. You got to think of the, Chachaji in Bihar when you are broadcasting in BBC Hindi, and the Chacha in Bangladesh when you're broadcasting in Bangla, or somebody in West Bengal. You got to really, really think about your audience, what they expect, what is their level of understanding. So, for instance, you need to do more backgrounding when you are doing COVID stories for a regional audience, because you can expect somebody to understand more, have better understanding of COVID, not when it started, but after a while. In say English language broadcasting. You need to be more explicit, because at the grassroots level, Indian villages, reality often becomes a victim of, I won't say fake news here, but a lot of wrong propaganda or wrong kind of rumors. Let me make it that clear. Rumors. So a lot of things flies around. But so you need to be more specific, and you need to attribute that this is said by men of authority. So who has said this, rather than just say and get away with it. So that's why sourcing and attribution becomes extremely, extremely important. Yeah. And therefore, I would actually, how much time do I have more? Do I have about 5 to 10 minutes more? Hello.
So you can continue for next 2 to 3 minutes.
Next what? 15 minutes, you said?
Yeah. 5 minutes is fine. 5 minutes is fine.
5 minutes, okay, no problem. So I would, which means 5 minutes means it's time to wrap up, and it's part of my training to stick to time. So I would say that transmedia storytelling is not just a craft. It is a craft. The storytelling bit of it is an art, but the developing of the story is a science. It depends on hard research, adherence to facts. Facts are sacrosanct. Interpretations may vary, but facts are sacrosanct. And therefore, developing the story or basing the story, the way you build it up, the essential story, is as much science as art. The way to tell it is an art. And there, it's important whether, even when you are in a non-visual medium, there are people I've seen in radio whose dispatches are very, very graphic. You can actually visualize just listening to radio without seeing any visual, without seeing any camera work. There are people like Mark Tully who taught me broadcasting, Sir Mark Tully. Is that when you heard him on radio in the 1980s and 90s before BBC turned to television, you could actually visualize the scenario or the scene, rather, not the scenario, but the scene. When you heard him, that was the skill. That was how built up the story, and maybe with a little bit of play of sound here and there. But in radio, sound is most important element. You build up a story with sound, and not just sound bites of people talking, because just people talking doesn't make good medium. You need some effects. So sound effects, very important in radio. Television, it's actually the pictures, and pictures in sequence, because as John was saying, you can actually change the meaning of a complete thrust of a story by bringing in pictures out of context, which actually are not part of the essential story. Now that would be a shame. That would be a disaster. But the way to build up a good story in a visual medium like television, and surely in films, I mean both documentary, which is sort of driven by facts, and also fiction films, or rather feature films, which are largely fiction, is that the litmus test of it is that you place the pictures one after another without any sound, without anybody saying anything. And if people can make out, the audience can make out just by the sequence of pictures what the story is all about, then you are on. You've done your job. But if your sequencing of pictures, your sequencing of images go wrong, and it's not just what you have shot, what your camera person has shot, that's where the journalist or the filmmaker comes in. Is that the raw footage is like the big glass jar. It drops different elements, shards all over, and then you sort of craft it into a flowing narrative. That's where sequencing, or the right sequence, is extremely important, because the sequence of pictures must follow the sequence of the storyline that you are trying to build up. And if the two are not, if the two are in a bit of a mismatch, you have gone wrong. Your story is not told. You have actually you will end up confusing your audience. So it serves no purpose, because if audience comes out confused without understanding what you're trying to drive at, you're a bad storyteller. You're not in business. You're out. In journalism or in filmmaking, fiction, non-fiction, whatever, whichever domain of storytelling, unless your sequencing of the essential elements, be it sound, be it film, be it images, if that's not in consonance with the flow of the story, the narrative, it doesn't work. One bumps into another, and there is an obvious dissonance. So, to sum up, transmedia storytelling is very challenging, and especially when you do it in different languages. Even in the same language, when you broadcast in, say, English in an Indian channel and you do it for somebody like the BBC, it can be very, very different. You're doing it in the same language. The audience is different, the way you speak, many things actually have to be taken care of. And therefore, and I'm not talking of accents and stuff like that, but it's the focus, it's the sort of line that you take, the storyline. What makes a storyline that makes sense to an audience in India does not always make sense to somebody in Yorkshire. That doesn't work. So, an effective transmedia storyteller has to reconcile the gap between audiences, the gap between cultures, the gap between different languages in which the same story is being told, and of course, last but not the least, the gap or the difference between the different medium in which he or she is trying to tell the story. So when somebody like Liz Doucette or myself broadcast the same story in radio, line may be different. And for television, the way we start the story in radio and in television would be very, very different. Something maybe starting with sound effects and something which starts with a video, but particular, sort of angle, wide to mid to close up and then cutaway. So it all varies. So here, an effective, successful transmedia storyteller has to have, whichever original media he comes from, will have to have, by the time he becomes a transmedia storyteller, an effective command over the different medium in which he's trying to put the story out, the different audiences that he's trying to target. So medium, the reality of the medium is important. The audience, the different cultures that you have to, the cultural barrier actually, is to transcend that. And last but not the least, retain the essence of the story. So you don't change the story for a British audience and for an Indian audience or for a Russian audience. The essential story has to remain the same. And that's where the challenge really is. Thank you very much. I'll just take a small call. This is important. Hello?
Thank you, sir, for such insightful.
You may put off. You may put your device off. People don't understand this.
Thank you, sir, for such insightful session. Some of the takeaways from your session we just concluded, like you talked about journalistic realm, understanding of the story and medium is vital. Top line elements, structuring, language, audience engagement, and more emphasis on the backgrounding. Thank you, sir. Our chief guest of the evening is Mr. Sengupta, who is the Director, Media and Creative of Govt India, New Delhi. And his brief introduction is he's a digital marketer, consultant, and brands, agencies, government, startup co-founder, influencer, columnist. He talks about advertising, development, digital India, good governance, and digital marketing. He worked with brands like Tata Tea, Mahindra, Times of India, etc., and help set up or enhance existing digital capabilities. The focus is on aligning integrated with digital core with business objectives. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. And I was just listening to the previous speakers and, very impressed by the quality of, the experiences and so on. So thank you for such a such an honorable introduction. I forgot that I wrote it myself. Yeah, so my name is Shubho, and I've been in, my background is advertising. I started in the 90s and, advertising, marketing, both on the agency side and the client side. I've worked for, large agencies, large brands, the world's biggest brands and so on. Currently, yes, I'm with the government. I kind of enhance the digital content, the narrative for various government ministries, departments, and so on. So, that's what I do more or less. And okay, so how much time do I have? About 10 minutes. Is that right? About 9:10. It's about 9:01 right now.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, transmedia storytelling is what we used to call in advertising, I mean, still do, integrated marketing, in a sense, integrated storytelling. So you have, a plethora of, devices these days, to tell various aspects of the story. And I will not get into that. I think the previous speakers have, done a very good job of, kind of fragmenting the different platforms that you have. So, I will just speak briefly about my experience of being, when we used to do storytelling in the 90s, and it's not that it's completely changed. It was a very, linear kind of storytelling. You started from point A, and you went to point B, and then you went to point C, and so on, right? And it was a very 2 + 2 4 kind of progression. Okay, so the stories would be, I mean, if you look at a television commercial, for example, the stories would be, initially there would be some little bit of suspense, and then there would be a build up, and then would be a crescendo, and then there would be a drop, and then there would be a reveal at the end. So that was traditional storytelling. And, more or less whatever medium you kind of consumed in those days, in the 90s, it was more or less the same, right? Everyone kind of imitated each other. Now what has happened is, because of the plethora of digital devices, which, have short attention span, long attention span, and, so on and so forth, all that has kind of gone for a toss. So, there are platforms where you seem to be starting the story from the middle or even from the end, right? It's no longer a linear, hero grows up, there's this anti-hero, there's this heroine, then there's the story, then there's a reveal. So, that has gone for a toss, primarily because of these digital mediums. I mean, you have to tell a story in 30 seconds these days on Instagram Reels. I'm sure you're familiar with it, right? It's not even YouTube. Nobody cares about a story. I mean, the new generation of digital natives, right? They're used to stories which are told in 1 minute. And I grew up a story where we used to, I come from an age where you used to wait for, some whatever short story or cartoon or whatever for a week, sometimes for a month, right? So, the technology has changed storytelling hugely. Technology has changed everything. But what I want to speak about, and this is my second point, is what is at the core of storytelling? Whether you are talking about analog storytelling or digital storytelling or anything in between, to my mind, it's values, right? It's a set of values which kind of which are interpreted in different ways on different platforms, right? It's not about the story, really. It's about the values. So if you're looking at, a lot of political parties use this transmedia storytelling these days, right? So they're all trying to kind of push or sell one particular ideology, right? And what you think are news announcements, etc., basically ideology, right? So, and you might have seen, in recent times, what is it, as a particular state in North India, UP, went to elections, suddenly these, communal kind of things started breaking out, right? In different platforms, different stories on different platforms. So somewhere it was a hijab story, somewhere else it was, in New Delhi, where I live right now, it's clothes meat shops or something, different stories. And I'm seeing a lot of Instagram 30-second reels pushing a particular narrative, communal narrative, right? They're very slick, very well edited. The story is the same. It goes back to the same. If you go back, right, it's about the same values. I will not go into whether it's a good value or a bad value. That's for you to figure out. But that is what is happening, right? So we are all, in this virtual room, we're all very live in very interesting times where technology and values are kind of crisscrossing each other, telling stories. for different audiences. It's become very, very fragmented, as any media observer will tell you. It's, it's no longer about, what I used to do in advertising, which is basically sell a car or a soap or a t-shirt or a, pair of shoes, whatever. The core value of the car is the same, right? If it's a Volvo, it's about safety, it's about, trust, dependency, and so on. And you talk about a Volvo in different ways. You do, print, you do television, you do, etc. You do an actual live demo, but it's all about how safe a Volvo car is, right? And you do it for different geographies and age groups, of course, right? But now, the Volvo car is, I don't know, the left or the right, or, some other political, ideological persuasion, right? So that's what the Volvo car has become, right? And, you choose your platform where you can talk about a particular value the best in the particular, boundaries you have of time or, anything else. So I find that very interesting. There are so many similarities with, advertising from 100 years back, right? It's just that technology is so obtrusive. It has changed the way we tell stories completely. It's no longer the, I mean, if you had to tell the story of the Mahabharata now, it's no longer about, the way we heard it from our grandmothers. I don't know, someone might say, listen, I'm just interested in, what Krishna tells Arjun. For me, that's the Mahabharata, and I want that in a 30-second capsule. That's the way that, a 16-year-old will consume the Mahabharata, right? And someone might say, listen, I don't even, I want a very slow build up for 20 minutes, right? For me, that's the Mahabharata, or through a dance drama or, something else. So, it's all very, very fragmented, and there are no rules. And tomorrow, all this is going to change. There'll be a new wave of technology where storytelling, whatever you call it, is going to change completely again, right? So my, suggestion to, listeners, especially young people on this webinar is, technology is going to keep changing, and your narratives are going to keep changing. But what is at the core of storytelling is, values, whether you're a political party or whether you're, selling a product or individual or reporting or whatever it is, so if you understand the values, then you can tell a good story. So, it's not about a story, it's about, the ideology, if I may use that word. Thank you. That is all. Thank you very much.
Momita, before you bring the next speaker, I would like to ask our good friend Shubho. Hi Shubho, this is Ujjwal here from Dhaka. I'm speaking from Dhaka. So,
hi, Dara.
Very good, very good. I really appreciated the series of People's Padma winner stories that you shared on Facebook. Very good stories, fabulous stories about some completely grassroots people doing fabulous work, apparently common people doing uncommon work. Don't you think that these stories could have been actually much better told transmedia, and can still be told transmedia, through radio, through television series, through a short web series maybe, or documentary series, then in print, no doubt, in multiple ways, and largely involving the youth. You are telling the stories, I am above 50, I am enjoying it, is fine. But it is important for people in 20s to know those stories. What would you suggest for that? Just a comment, because you have gone close to this.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I agree with every word that you said. It has to, the stories were so unique. And I met, this 125-year-old man who lives in Varanasi, and he's been doing yoga he does yoga for 3 hours every day, right? So, these stories really resonated with young people on Instagram and so on, there were actually about, I think about close to 200 Padma winners. And because of a very small team, we couldn't do justice to creating enough content about these people, but we are still going on. We'll take a couple of months and we are doing exactly what you just mentioned. So, we are kind of taking out interesting facets about these people. And at some point there'll be a one-to-one kind of thing. Also, people can engage with these Padma winners also on various platforms. So I get what you're saying. I completely agree.
There is this TED talk. Can we have Padma talks like that? For example, they're coming to universities, and whichever is the nearer university and whatever is their mother tongue, let them come to that. The Odia Padma winner from the grassroots goes to a Odisha university and speaks in Odia language. Padma talks, something like that. Padma talks hosted by Shubho. Great, it would be if you do that. In some, and I'll get you platforms in some universities I know. So and the stories you shared on Facebook were very, very inspiring. I might say very, very inspiring. Thank you for being present today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. An honor. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for this fantastic session. Some of the takeaways from your session are that transmedia storytelling is not a linear anymore, and it's more about storytelling. And because of digital platforms and medium, technology change, core of storytelling also change, but values are very integral part. And you suggested that technology will change, values is integral, then you can tell a good story. And different audience, you serve with the different audience. It's very fragmented medium, but still values are very important. Thank you so much for this session, sir. And now we come to the last segment. Our next guest of the evening is eminent educator, Professor Dr. Nisha Pawar, Professor and Head of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Shivaji University, Kolhapur, Maharashtra. And she has a wonderful career throughout. She has been a coordinator, MA Mass Communication, Shivaji University, Kolhapur. Former coordinator, late Gigi Jadhav, Journalism Chair, Shivaji University, Kolhapur. And she has quite a few books published like Women and Media, Mass Communication as a textbook, edited book on Lok Patrakar, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. And for tonight, she is one of the GMEC proudly announces that Eminent Media Educator Award to Professor Nisha Pawar. And over to you, ma'am, for your few words to our audience.
Before that, the video, please.
Yeah,
the host
please.
will show the video, kindly. The short video, the host will show.
Nice.
Host, you can repeat it.
Wonderful.
Madam, thank you for your presence. And
yeah, it's really a wonderful video. Yeah, thank you very much, sir.
We will share the video with you. And more importantly, thank you for being there and doing work in the hinterland, I must say, of the beautiful state of Maharashtra from Kolhapur, and also bringing media and communication education to not only urban children, but also children of the rural areas of
Yes.
Maharashtra and nearby. So a fabulous work of students from Maharashtra and perhaps Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh also reaching out. So a lot of work that you have been doing. I've met you a couple of times. GMAC, me as the secretary, our Shubha Sengupta as our honored mentor, and Madam Momita Dedas as our working committee member. We are honored on behalf of my president KG Suresh, also honored to bestow upon you the eminent media educator status, one of the 75 top media educators of India in the 75th year of India's independence. We will come out with a book titled 75 Jewels of Indian Media Education, where your life story in brief, your picture, and an article from you shall go in. Just like of August 2022, when 75 years comes to an end, 76th year starts. It's indeed a pleasure, and thank you. And very patiently, you have been listening to all our foreign and Indian speakers so far. I'm sure you enjoyed the interaction. There are a lot of good content that they were sharing. So over to you now, Nisha Madam, for your
Yeah.
perspective on this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Ujjwal sir. Good evening, everybody. President, Vice President, and Working Committee of GMEC. Chairman Professor Subir Ghosh of today's 60th session of Global Communication Education Conclave, organized by GMEC. Keynote speaker, Dr. John Butcher, Chief guest, Shubho Sen Gupta, corporate speaker, Mr. Subir Bhomik, Momita Das, moderator of this session, and dear colleagues and friends. Thank you for having me in this session on transmedia storytelling. Transmedia storytelling is relatively a very new phenomena, the transmedia narrative. It is called transmedia, multi-platform, and enhanced storytelling represent the future of media. I read the article entitled Transmedia Storytelling in MIT Technology Review, written by Henry Jenkins, who coined the term transmedia storytelling. His research article was published in 2003 in MIT Technological Review. While reading this article, I also felt it is high time to focus on indigenous content of Indian transmedia storytelling, as Professor Subir Ghosh and Professor Ujjwal sir mentioned in their speech. We have to prepare our students with the skills of transmedia storytelling and start to focus on the human real stories and their suffering. We should not follow the Western ideas as they focus on fairy tales and science fictions. We have to start focusing on more on women's suffering and their real stories. With this, I will sum here, and I am grateful to GMEC for confirming me Eminent Media Educator Awards. I would like to dedicate this award to my parents, my father, late Devidas Mude, and my mother, Nirmala Mude, and my dear students of Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Shivaji University, Kolhapur, for believing in the honest and committed teacher inside me. It is really a great academic journey. We started at the very young age of 23 by joining the journalism department at Shivaji University, Kolhapur in 1991. Being a small town girl, educating and imparting media education in language journalism of much of time, shaping the department single-handedly and converting it in one of the premier departments, not only in the state of Maharashtra, but across the nation, which gives me immense satisfaction. Today, really, I'm very happy for considering my contribution to journalism education field. GMEC has confirmed my name for this award. Thank you very much, Professor Ujjwal sir, and GMEC President, Vice President, and working committee members of GMEC. Thank you again. Thank you for giving me this wonderful award. Thank you very much, sir.
Madam, this framed certificate with signatures of all the 9 countries' vice presidents, our president, secretary, and Indian vice presidents will come to you within a month in a framed manner, proper, so that you can preserve that. And I request you to write an article on multimedia storytelling with focus on Marathi language That would be great.
Yes.
How in Marathi
Yes, yes.
multimedia storytelling is developing, and also a short your life story in brief. These two will, some photographs will go in the book as well. So that's all. And GMEC after this 75 evenings will also start other newer programs, and there will be a round table in maximum universities that we can reach. So round table on any one theme, contemporary theme. So we would love to, sometimes one of us would go to your university also and would love to have a round table with your students on some contemporary topic or issue of media education or media practice. That's all. Thank you for your presence. And back to Momita ma'am to carry forward.
Thank you to all. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you to all for your presence in this evening. I hereby give my vote of thanks to the organizers and the guests of this evening to spare their valuable time for us and enlighten us on the theme. To end the session, I'll end by the words of Paulo Coelho. It is always important to know when something has reached its end. Closing circles, shutting doors, finishing chapters, it doesn't matter what we call it. What matters is to leave in the past those moments in life that are over. Thank you so much for today's session. Thank you. I think we can end this.
Momita, you have moderated very well, bringing in the key points of every speaker, connecting to philosophies, contemporary philosophies at every level, and also introducing each one very effectively. Do cooperate in finally, yes, our colleague is saying indeed a wonderful session. Madam Novina is saying, indeed it has been, and having these galaxy of speakers was fabulous, and all of them are very senior level. Yes, very right. Our mentor Subhashan Gupta is saying very good moderation. You have actually brought in the critical points at every level. Ambadas ji, so nice to see you, Ambadas ji. Please get connected. I would like to involve you in some program of GMEC. Ambadas, Professor Ambadas, who is there in the audience. We may get connected in some platform or the other. Thank you. With that, we will bring this session, the 57th session of 75 events of GMAC titled Global Communication Education Conclave. 22 more to go, right? Is it 57th today? Right,
Yes, sir.
Momita?
57, yeah.
So 22 more to go till we make the 75. Thank you very much and good night. Have a great evening.
Good night. Good night, sir.
Good night, sir. Thank you.